Hello, and welcome to Mesquite Living Waters Fellowship's Wednesday's Word Series. We invite you now to sit back, relax, and enjoy today's message.
I've named this message, "There's Nothing for It, Mr. Frodo." Now that line comes from the Lord of the Rings series of books. John Roland Ruel Tolkien, now you know why we call him J.R.R. Tolkien, was a linguist and a professor at Oxford University. He actually wrote the Lord of the Rings series to give background to the languages that he created. He was not only a linguist, he knew multiple languages. I would say several, but it's more like many. He spoke several languages and he had working knowledges of more. But Tolkien was more than just a linguist and a university professor. He was also a Christian. And now, while Tolkien didn't like allegories and didn't use them in his books, he embedded Christian concepts all throughout the Lord of the Rings series and The Hobbit. And it's easy to see some of them, and some of them you just got to think a little bit about them. But you look at the Hobbits. The Hobbits were the heroes of the series. And what does the Bible tell us? That God chooses the foolish things and the weak things to confound the wise and the strong. And we look at Aragorn as the returning king. He's a representative of Jesus Christ, the returning king that we are waiting for. And Gandalf died as Gandalf the Grey and came back in a symbolic resurrection as Gandalf the White. So these things are embedded throughout Tolkien's books. And there's another one. Look at Gollum. Gollum perfectly depicts the dichotomy that Paul described in Romans. I don't do the things I want to do, and I do the things I don't want to do. Even Gandalf spoke to it. He said Gollum loves and hates the ring just as he loves and hates himself. And that's the battle within all of us, Christians and people in the world alike. We're always struggling with trying to do the thing that we want to do and not do things that we don't want to do. And yet we never seem to work it out. So these things were embedded in Tolkien's story. And we're going to go to another one a little later on. But the Bible is like that too. But that phrase, "there's nothing for it," means here is a situation that I find myself in that I don't like, but I can't do anything about it. Kind of like me being up here this morning. Those same situations are in the Bible. So what happens when we find ourselves in a difficult situation and when the road to victory leads through a valley of misfortune and hardship? How do we handle it? Well, we can look at characters in the Bible and see what they had to deal with. I think the first one was Noah. He had to build an ark and rescue his family because there was a flood coming that destroyed the whole world. So for 120 years, he labored to build an ark to save himself and the animals on the planet. And then you look at Joseph. Joseph was sold into slavery by his brothers. And so he's serving as a servant in the house of his master, and his wife accuses him of assault. She ripped all his clothes off and he ran out of the house naked, but it was all Joseph's fault, right? And he ends up in prison. So he has to go through slavery and prison before he ends up serving in Pharaoh's palace as the number 2 ruler in Egypt. And not only that, it saved his family. And when they finally were reunited, Joseph and his brothers, he said, "You meant this for evil, but God meant it for good." But look at what Joseph had to endure: slavery, false accusations, prison. Finally, he became the ruler that God had promised him that he was going to be. We see the same thing with David. David was anointed the next king of Israel when he was 17 years old. But it was 20 years before he became king over all of Israel. And in the meantime, he was hunted down by Saul. He was tracked. He lived in caves. He had to take shelter with the enemies of Israel. And his own men at one time were going to kill him because they had been let off on a mission while another group of people had raided their families. And then David encouraged himself in the Lord, and they went out after them and rescued everyone. But the kingship just didn't get handed to him. God didn't come in and just anoint him and, okay, now tomorrow you're going to sit on the throne. There were hardships that he had to go through. We look at Paul. Paul says, I got to go to Jerusalem for the festival. And the prophets told him, if you go to Jerusalem, this is what's going to happen. The Jews are going to attack you. They're going to turn you over to the Roman guard, and you are going to end up in prison. And Paul says, I got to go. And he did, and that's exactly what happened. Not quite the way the prophets described it, because the Jews didn't turn him over. Actually, the Romans rescued him from the Jews. And 40 of them said, we're going to swear a vow not to eat or drink until we kill Paul. But Paul ended up in prison, but that opportunity that the prison gave him was to write numerous letters of the gospel. We have books today that we never would have had if it hadn't been for Paul ending up in jail. And probably the most significant one is what Jesus faced. In the Garden of Gethsemane, he was under so much stress that he was literally sweating drops of blood. And his prayer was, Lord, if there's any way out of this, if there's some way for this cup that's come to me to be cast aside, if there's another way to do this, Lord, please let that happen, but I want your will. And God's answer to Jesus was, there's nothing for it. This is what's got to be done. And in Hebrews chapter 12, we read that it's talking about Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith, who for the joy set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and is sat down in the right hand of the throne of God. Jesus had to go through the cross. And that joy that was set before him, that was you and me and everyone else who's come to know the Lord. But this was a hard thing. This was the worst thing that Jesus ever had to confront. But there was nothing for it. He had to go through it, because without Jesus doing what he did on the cross, there's no salvation for us. Now, I've seen in my own life situations that I'd rather not face, and yet I had to do them. And I was working at a job, and the company was struggling, and they were making cutbacks, and they come to me one day and says, well, we don't need you anymore. So I got laid off from my job. Well, you can see I got fired. They found somebody else that they thought might be able to pull them out of the trouble they were in. And I had an opportunity to take a job with another company before that, and I didn't do it because it was only part-time and I needed a full-time job. So this was a situation where God pushed me out the door. It was really weird. But I got a job with the other company, and my commute went from an hour to about 10 minutes. And the company wasn't struggling. They had money. We had great equipment, and they trained me. And I spent 23 years working there and finally retired from that place. But I wasn't going to do it because I didn't like the situation. And then there was another situation that was a little more serious than changing jobs. It was just about 12 years ago that I had quadruple bypass surgery. And I'm sitting in the hospital saying, Lord, why do I have to go through this? Why don't you just heal me? Why am I in this condition at all? I'm in surgery, which lasted 7 hours, and my wife and my family and my friends are all in the waiting room, and they've pushed tables and chairs together and sofas, and they're in there playing games. And the nurse comes in and she says, you guys are Christians, aren't you? She knew. She could see the difference. They weren't worried. So we end up with these situations in life that we don't like, but yet we got to face him. And that was another situation from Tolkien's book. When Frodo got to the cave inside the Mount Doom where this active volcano, he was supposed to throw the ring into the fire, but the power of the ring had grown so much stronger as it got close to the source of its creation that he couldn't do it. And he finally decided he was going to keep the ring for himself. And so Gollum comes through and he attacks Frodo and literally bites his finger off to get the ring. Now Frodo has suffered maiming and went through the rest of his life known as the nine-fingered Frodo. But in the struggle between Gollum and Frodo, Gollum falls with the ring into the lava and the ring is destroyed. And evil is destroyed in Middle-earth. Tolkien put that in the book because it would seem a tragedy. And he said the cross appears as a tragedy to people. They don't understand why it happened. You know, he wrote in Corinthians that the Jews look for a sign and the Greeks look for wisdom. But we preach Christ crucified. And to the Jews, that's a stumbling block. And to the Greeks, it's foolishness. But to the Jews and Greeks that are called of God, it is the power and wisdom of God. So there are things that happen that we don't understand. And yet they're part of God's purpose. They're part of his design. And they might look foolish to someone on the outside, but when you know the truth, it makes all the sense in the world. Well, there was a time, if I can take you back to Middle-earth once more, in the Mines of Moria, Frodo is lamenting the ring ever coming to him. He talks to Gandalf the wizard. He said, "I wish the ring had never come to me. I wish none of this had happened." And Gandalf says, "So do all who live to see such times. But that is not for them to decide. All that we have to decide is what to do with the time that is given us." And there are other forces at work in the world besides the will of evil. Bilbo was meant to find the ring, in which case you were meant to have it too. And that is an encouraging thought. So we find ourselves here in the middle of a pandemic that's gone on for almost a year. People have lost jobs. People have lost businesses. People have lost loved ones. You know, some people are looking at the world around them. We see the turmoil in our nation. We see the division politically and amongst the people. We see the hardships that folks are facing. And they're starting to wonder, is this the end? The Bible tells us there's going to be a falling away of Christians. People are going to turn from the faith because of the hardship. But he also tells us to persevere. You look back at those times and you see what Joseph and Noah and David and Paul, what they went through, what Jesus went through, what carried them through the situation. It was faith in God, faith in the promises of God. When I went in for my heart surgery, I wasn't worried about coming out of the surgery. I knew God had a promise for my life, and I had not experienced it yet. I knew I was going to come through the surgery. I was really concerned about how hard the recovery was going to be, but I was not the least bit concerned about surviving the surgery. The same thing. David was promised that he was going to be king of Israel. He believed what God told him. And Jesus saw what was on the other side. He went through the cross, he was resurrected, and he sat down at the right hand of God the Father. The promises of God are yes and amen. He's going to pull us through this. So if you're facing what seems to be something that there's nothing for, there's no pill, there's no answer, there's no check in the mail, you just got to go through it. What are the promises that God has made you? Where is he taking you? And know that all of it is in his plan.
I can't do this, Sam.
I know. It's all wrong. By rights, we shouldn't even be here. But we are. It's like in the great stories, Mr. Frodo. The ones that really mattered. Full of darkness and danger they were. And sometimes you didn't want to know the end. Because how could the end be happy? How could the world go back to the way it was when so much bad had happened? But in the end, it's only a passing thing. This shadow. Even darkness must pass. A new day will come. And when the sun shines, it'll shine out the clearer. Those were the stories that stayed with you. That meant something. Even if you were too small to understand why. But I think, Mr. Frodo, I do understand. I know now. Folk in those stories had lots of chances of turning back, only they didn't. They kept going. Because they were holding on to something.
What are we holding on to, Sam?
That there's some good in this world, Mr. Frodo. And it's worth fighting for.
Thank you for joining me on this message.